If you really want to understand what's happening in Belarus today, all the protests, the politics, its complicated relationship with Russia, you can't just look at the headlines. You have to go back, way back. Because this is a nation whose very identity has been caught in a tug-of-war for centuries. It's a story of incredible golden ages, absolutely devastating wars, and a constant, powerful struggle to simply exist.
So here's how we're going to break this down. We're starting at the very beginning, with the first Slavic states. Then we'll jump to a medieval golden age, when this land was the heart of a European superpower. After that, we'll see what happens when it gets squeezed between the rising empires of Poland and Russia. Then comes the 20th century, and the trauma from that is just unimaginable. And all of that leads us to the chaotic birth of its modern independence, and finally to the Lukashenko era that has defined Belarus for the last 30 years.
All right, let's kick things off at the very beginning. I mean, long before there was a country called Belarus, or even the idea of it. We're going to trace the history of this land from the first humans who settled here, all the way to the rise of the first powerful Slavic states that would become the true foundation of Belarusian identity. I mean, just look at this timeline for a second. The depth of history here is incredible. We're talking 400,000 BCE for the earliest known settlement. That's just wild. But the real game changer, the moment that really sets the stage, is in the 6th to 8th centuries. Slavic tribes start moving into the area. And here's the key part. They don't just conquer the local Baltic people. They mix, they merge, they assimilate. And that cultural fusion is what creates the bedrock for everything that follows, including early cities like Polotsk, which pops up in the history books in 862. Okay, so out of all these early states, you've got to know about Polotsk. It was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the region. You see, while a lot of other principalities were falling in line with the big power of the day, Kiev and Rus, Polotsk was always pushing back. They were fiercely independent. And this wasn't just about politics. They were a cultural powerhouse, building a unique identity right from the very start.
And if you need one person to understand Polotsk's whole vibe, it's this guy, Vyacheslav the Sorcerer. What a name, right? The stories about him are just incredible. They say he was born with magical signs, that he could shapeshift into a wolf and run across the land at night. He was a total thorn in the side of Kiev, constantly defying them. Now, whether you believe the magic or not doesn't really matter. The legend itself tells you everything you need to know about how Polotsk saw itself. Fierce, a little bit wild, and absolutely independent.
So the old world of Kiev and Rus gets completely shattered by the Mongol invasions. It's total chaos across the region. But out of those ashes, something remarkable happens. The lands that would become Belarus, they don't just survive. They become the very heart of a brand new European superpower.
And that superpower was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Now, the name can be a little misleading, because while the rulers were ethnically Lithuanian, the core of this state, its territory, its people, and even its official written language was all based in what we call Belarus today. This massive, multicultural empire, which at one point was the largest country in Europe, was really the first Belarusian golden age. And this is what made it so different from anything else in Europe at the time. Think about it. You've got pagan kings from Lithuania ruling over this huge Orthodox Slavic population. And what do? They don't force everyone to convert. Instead, they actually adopt the local language, Old Belarusian, as the official language of government and law. It was this incredible melting pot, built on a surprising amount of religious tolerance while the rest of Europe was tearing itself apart. And that legacy, that idea of a distinct, tolerant European identity, that's something that sticks around. But, golden ages don't tend to last forever. The Grand Duchy knew it needed a powerful ally to survive. They found one in the Kingdom of Poland. But this alliance, which started as a partnership for mutual protection, would end up changing everything. And not always for the better. So in 1569, they officially joined together to form the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And on paper, this thing is a behemoth, a real superpower. But there's a catch. Inside this new megastate, Polish culture and political influence start to dominate. If you were a Belarusian noble and you wanted to get ahead, well, you started speaking Polish, you might convert to Catholicism, and slowly but surely that unique Belarusian culture and language started getting pushed to the side. And this slide just lays it out so clearly. It's really a 1-2 punch against the language. First, in the Commonwealth, Polish officially replaces Old Belarusian. Then, a century later, when the Russian Empire takes over, they do the exact same thing, but with Russian. They don't just impose the Russian language, they literally ban the word Belarus from official use, calling it the Northwestern Territory. It's a story of a culture being squeezed from both sides.
And then the entire thing just collapses with stunning speed. In just a little over 2 decades, Russia, Prussia, and Austria literally carve up the Commonwealth until there's nothing left. It's just gone from the map. By 1795, every last piece of modern Belarus is under the control of the Russian Empire, and that's where it would stay for more than a century.
All right, now we hit the 20th century. And honestly, it is hard to find the words for what happened here. This land became ground zero for the most brutal conflicts in human history. The level of devastation is almost impossible to comprehend. But somehow, out of all that suffering, a modern national consciousness would finally be forged. So in the chaos of World War I and the collapse of the Russian Empire, there's this tiny spark of hope. National activists get together and declare the Belarusian People's Republic. It's a huge symbolic moment, the first attempt at a modern state. But in reality, it had no army, no international recognition, and it was caught between the German and Soviet armies. It just wasn't going to last. And that dream of a unified country was completely shattered. After the Polish-Soviet War ended, the Treaty of Riga in 1921 literally drew a line right through the heart of the nation. Just imagine that. The western half went to Poland, the eastern half to the Soviet Union. For the next 18 years, Belarus was a nation divided, with families and a culture split between two totally different worlds. In 1939, the Soviet Union invades Poland and reunifies Belarus. But this was just the prelude to the greatest catastrophe in its history, because in 1941, Nazi Germany invades, and the human cost is just sickening. 1/4 of the entire population was killed. Let that sink in for a moment. 1 out of every 4 people. No other country in the entire war, none, suffered a loss on that scale. And we're not just talking about soldiers on a battlefield. This was a war against the entire population. The partisan resistance in Belarus was massive, so the Nazi response was one of pure, calculated terror. Over 9,000 villages were just wiped off the map. In 186 of those, they burned the village to the ground with every single man, woman, and child locked inside. It's a level of brutality that's hard to even wrap your head around. So you have to understand, this experience left a deep, collective trauma that has shaped the country for generations. This wasn't just war. It was, as the quote says, unimaginable horror. And that kind of trauma creates this powerful, deep-seated desire for stability, for peace, for never letting that happen again. And that desire for stability at almost any price is going to become a huge factor in what comes next. After the war, Belarus becomes this key industrial hub for the Soviet Union, its assembly plant. Then suddenly, in 1991, the whole Soviet system collapses, and Belarus is independent. But this wasn't a moment of celebration like the fall of the Berlin Wall. For Belarus, it was a moment of deep confusion and crisis.
Yeah, see, unlike its Baltic neighbors, Belarus didn't really have a huge popular movement fighting for independence. It just happened. The USSR fell apart and suddenly they had a country. The people in charge were all old-school Soviet officials. They were completely lost. They had a new nation, but absolutely no idea what to do with it.
And this is what that looked like in the early 90s. It was a perfect storm. The economy was in a total freefall. People's life savings became worthless overnight. Wild capitalism meant corruption was everywhere. And for the average person who remembered the stability of the Soviet era, maybe it wasn't great, but you had a job, this new reality was a disaster. It created this massive political vacuum, just waiting for a strongman to step in and promise to restore order. And right on cue, into that vacuum of chaos and nostalgia steps Alexander Lukashenko. He was a former director of a state-run farm, and he knew exactly what people were feeling. He tapped right into that public anger and that yearning for a strong hand. And his rise to power was just methodical. It was a step-by-step playbook. First, he makes a name for himself as this big anti-corruption crusader. He wins the 1994 election easily. Then, boom, a referendum in 1995 to get rid of the historical national flag and bring back a Soviet-style one. Another referendum a year later to give himself sweeping new powers and gut the parliament. And then the final move in 2004, a referendum to get rid of presidential term limits, making it possible for him to rule for life. Now, his entire rule has been a balancing act with Russia. He has absolutely relied on cheap Russian oil and gas to prop up his state-controlled economy. But the personal relationship with Vladimir Putin has always been tense. And nothing really sums it up better than this reported quote from Putin, this idea of separating the flies from the cutlets. Essentially, Russia's economic support is the valuable cutlet, and Lukashenko is just the annoying fly buzzing around it that they have to put up with. For decades, Lukashenko's basic deal with the Belarusian people, You give up political freedom, and in return, I give you stability. It kind of held. But in 2020, that deal shattered. After a presidential election that was so obviously fraudulent, the country just exploded. We saw the largest protests in its history. And look at the symbol they rallied under, that historical white, red, white flag, the very one Lukashenko had suppressed back in 1995. It was a powerful reawakening of a national identity he had tried to bury.
The regime responded to those 2020 protests with brutal force. That crackdown, combined with allowing Belarus to be used as a staging ground for Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, has left the country more isolated and more dependent on Moscow than ever before. It all leads to this fundamental and frankly heavy question for the nation's future. After this long contested history, is genuine sovereignty still possible? Or are we watching the final chapter of its independence fade away?